Good evening. Oh, a little better than that. Good evening. That's what I'm talking about. All right. I am so glad to have come back, and I've already been given a warning from I won't say who, but they said the Sunday night sermon's supposed to be a little shorter than the Sunday morning, and I got material and I got to get through it. So I'm going to take my time, but I really think you're going to enjoy this lesson. While I'm talking a little bit about it, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 16. That's where we're going to be this evening. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to be in verse 13 to start. Before I really get into it, I need to tell you that this lesson that I'm about to teach is really a part of a class. It's a part of a class that I do on the early church. This is the intro to said class. It takes me about 3 months to teach the class, and typically about 9 to 10 lessons, 45-minute lesson each. But this intro is about a 25-minute intro to that class. I got the bulk of this material from a theologian named Ray who does a video series called Walking with God in the Desert. And the thing that really stuck out to me about the way that Ray was teaching this material was that Ray really dove into the culture and the history of these communities when he taught the text. And before we ever begin to study the Bible, the first thing I think we have to understand is we cannot understand Scripture unless we try to better understand the people that it was written to. We cannot understand what God is fully trying to say unless we understand His audience. And Matthew chapter 16 is a great example. And before I even dig into that, we need to talk a little bit about Jesus. I know that sounds a cliche, but Jesus was a rabbi. Okay, most of you knew that. You knew that at some point in time in the New Testament, Jesus was called a rabbi, a teacher. And what a rabbi did was more than just teach the Torah, and Torah being the Old Testament. A rabbi had a job, and his job was to help create community. He wasn't supposed to just teach the people. He was supposed to create a community in which the people could live and they could thrive in together. And everything the rabbi did, his followers did. He would select about 10 to 12 people to be his followers, so it wasn't uncommon when Jesus selected 12 disciples. Wasn't an uncommon number. He'd select about 10 to 12 people that would be his followers. And they would do everything the rabbi did. And I'm not trying to sell that short. I'm not trying to sell that short right now. If the rabbi went and jumped in a lake with all of his clothes on, his followers were supposed to go to the lake and jump in with all their clothes on. I know that a lot of you are parents in here, and you've probably given the old adage to your children once or twice. Well, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you? Well, if a rabbi jumped off a bridge, his followers would jump off the bridge right after him. That's just how it worked. But more than that, a rabbi had a calling to teach the people about faith. Faith in community. And when we look at that, we have to understand that it was the Greek model that taught us that one man should stand apart. One man should try to do it on his own. Judaism, up until the point of Jesus coming to us, taught be together. Faith is built together. And for some of us as Westerners, what we think to be faith is not exactly what a Jewish person would have thought to have been faith. And this is very important. I want you to keep this in mind for what we talk about a little bit later. Faith is a call and a commitment to action. It's not empty. It's not just, I have faith in God. Faith for the Jewish person was a call to say, I have faith in God and I'm going to show people that I have faith in God. So now that we have all that background, let's read verses 13 through 20 of Matthew chapter 16. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Now, many of us have probably heard this passage before, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this passage means, what some other congregations look at this passage and say. But before we can dig in and understand what Jesus is saying to his disciples, before we can understand what's happening in this conversation, we have to understand one very, very important thing. What is Caesarea Philippi famous for? And that's something that most of us probably don't know. That's something that, in all honesty, if you haven't done some deep digging, you probably will not know what Caesarea Philippi is famous for. Maybe Rodney has done a sermon on it at some point. So it could be something that, y'all have heard before, and we're about to just go over it again. But if he hasn't, I think you're going to see some really cool new things here. The first thing you need to know about Caesarea Philippi is that this place was very evil. Caesarea Philippi wasn't a booming city, booming district in terms of metropolises or economy. But this place was very, very evil because they had a certain temple. They had a certain temple that sat next to a certain cave. And I'm talking about the cave and the temple at the foot of Mount Hermon. That's where Jesus is. That's where he's brought his disciples. If it says he's in Caesarea Philippi, it means he's at the foot of Mount Hermon, because that's what this district was. It was the Mount Hermon area. And there was a temple there. It was a very big religious place. A lot of people from all over the world would come here just to see this temple. And there was a very large cave there that I just a minute ago that Josephus, a writer from the 200s, said that was bottomless. Okay, and the people that lived in this area believed that the river that ran out of this cave literally, not figuratively, literally ran to the gates of hell. That's how Josephus puts it. People believed that this river was the River Styx. And if you study mythology at all, you know that the River Styx is where all dead people would go. They'd have the coins on their eyes, and the gatekeeper would basically let them pass for the coins. So these people probably had a legitimate fear of this cave because they understood it to be evil. So what did they do? They built a temple right next to it. In about 330 BC, Alexander the Great, when he was trying to go to Asia Minor and conquer the world, came to this place, and he built a shrine to the shepherd's fertility god Pan. Now, Pan is a gross god. He's a really disgusting god. Almost every statue that has ever depicted Pan has depicted him as a half goat, a half man, and he's always standing really sexually suggestive, and he's almost always nude. He was a disgusting god. And if you've ever studied anything about fertility gods, you know that people would do almost anything to be able to have a good crop, to be able to have children, to be able to make money. They would do anything. And so what started out as just this little shrine became this huge temple. And there was a goat enclosure where they would sacrifice the goats for this fake god. And to the Jewish community in that area, it had to have been the most ungodly thing that they could have imagined. It was the most ungodly sight, completely contrary to the Torah, completely contrary to everything their rabbis taught them about faith and community. That's what this place stood for. And so when we understand what's happening at Caesarea Philippi, we go back to this conversation. And if I'm a disciple and I'm at this place, even if I'm with Jesus, I'm probably feeling a little uncomfortable right now. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable being in this place. And I'm wondering exactly what Jesus wants. And so we go back to the conversation. He says, "Who am I? Peter, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says to him, "That's awesome. You did not get that from human education. That has been revealed to you. That is a prophecy." And then Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church." And that's where it gets a little tough from a theological standpoint. I'm just going to take a quick time out to address this. When Jesus says, "I'm going to build my church on this rock," I do not believe that Jesus is saying he is going to build the church upon Peter. And that's what the Catholic Church had taught for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and still hangs on to, is that Peter was named the first pope because of this statement. I'm going to give you two quick reasons why I disagree with that sentiment. The first is this: the word rock in that passage, I don't believe was used figuratively. I think it's literal. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And two, if Jesus had intended for there to be such a thing, he would have commanded it very strictly. He would have not have left that up to interpretation. So those are my two reasons that I don't think that when Jesus says this, he's saying that he's going to build his church upon Peter. Some scholars will say that he's just saying that he'll build the church upon the confession, which I think could be a fairly accurate interpretation of what's happening here. But I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to say that Jesus is saying, "I am going to build my church upon this rock." And I think when he says that, the disciples understood that he meant he was going to build his church upon the evil that was in that valley. He was going to plant his church on top of that temple. And I think he means that because he says, "And the gates of Hades will not overcome it." A little bit down. The gates of Hades will not overcome it in the Mark version. That's important. It's important because this place is literally called the gates of Hades. So when I read this scripture, I'm not just going to try and take a little bit out of it to understand what's happening. I'm going to take all out of it. I'm going to understand the context. I'm going to understand the culture. I'm going to understand the location. And then I'm going to understand that Jesus Christ is basically saying, "I'm going to build my church upon evil." And if you look at the history of the early church, in Asia Minor, in Greece, in Italy, where did they build their churches? Well, if we got to do the whole 8-week class, you'd see every single place that they found a church in a temple dedicated to a god or goddess. Because the early followers of Christ understood that they could not be defeated. The early followers of Christ understood that not even the gates of hell could overcome the power of Jesus Christ. A little bit further down in verse 24, Jesus issues a command to his disciples. He issues them a command, and I've got to be honest, if they're at the Mount Hermon, there's no way that his disciples are the only people that are hearing this. And when we hear what Jesus says here, we have to understand that the cross in this time period is not a symbol of peace. It's not a symbol of hope. It's not a symbol of love. The cross in this time period is a symbol of pain and misery. And Jesus, as he's talking to his disciples, says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For who would ever save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Jesus, in the midst of this evil, in the midst of this horrible place, this place that is just the absolute epitome of sin, says, if you want to gain the world, stay there. But if you want something more eternal, pick up your cross and follow me. And what Jesus is basically saying is that it ain't going to be easy. It's going to be hard. There's going to be struggle. There's going to be pain. There's going to be times when you feel miserable. But would you rather gain the world and lose your soul, or live with me in eternity? And I think that's the most encouraging thing that Jesus could have said to his disciples. Because a little bit after this, basically, Jesus is going to start his path towards his crucifixion and his resurrection. And just a short time after that, these disciples are going to have to go out into the world. These early followers of Jesus are going to have to go out into the world and start telling the good news. Telling about the God who builds his churches on top of evil and conquers them. Telling of the God who picked up a cross and died for them. And these disciples are going to stand in front of kings, leaders of temples, rulers of nations, and they are going to proclaim Jesus Christ crucified and resurrected. And so I ask you tonight, are you willing to be people that go to the dark places? Are you willing to be people that go where no one else wants to go? Because that's what Jesus is calling his disciples right there. Don't run away from these places. These are the places that need me the most. As the people who lived amongst their sin in those temples, Jesus said, stop. Quit trying to find fulfillment there. I am fulfillment. I am hope. You're not going to find it in Pan. You're not going to find it in Apollo or Zeus or Dionysus. You will find your fulfillment in me. And he turns to his disciples and he says, are you going to be people that lead them? Are you going to be people that go to these places? The point is this. Generally, when we do our ministry, and I'm speaking not just for Leoma, I'm speaking for every church I've ever worked with. Generally, when we do ministry, we do it in the most comfortable places possible. And that's natural, right? We want to feel safe while we do it. We want to feel like we're in control of what's happening. I get that. I'm not going to knock that. I had a professor in college. His name's Scott Adair. One of the best theologians I've ever been around in my life. And not because he understood everything, but he just asked the simple questions. He asked the questions that nobody really wanted to ask, but he did it anyway. He ruffled some feathers sometimes, but he made real conversation happen. I took him for Life of Christ. We were studying Jesus. We got to a point where basically every single story was Jesus reaching out to someone who was broken or lost, a prostitute, a leper. And after we got through all of those stories, we had 10 minutes left in class. And he said, I'm going to let you go early. I'm going to leave you with a question. If Jesus walked into the student center, which was at Harding, if Jesus walked into the student center, where would he go? Where would he go in that student center? And so we left, and I guess I thought about maybe that question for 5 minutes. And then I went back to class later that week, and first thing he said was, what's your answer? I think the majority of the class had already forgotten the question. So he asked it again. If Jesus walked in this student center at Harding University, where would he go? Nobody raised their hand. Nobody knew what to say. It's Harding, right? No, there's no broken people, lost people at Harding. He looked at us and very bluntly said, if Jesus was in Searcy, Arkansas, I highly doubt he'd be at Harding University. But if he was, he would go to that part of the student center that you think he wouldn't go to. Jesus lived his ministry reaching out to people who needed healing. So why would our mission change? Right? Why would our mission change? We should be reaching out to people who need healing. And I know from being connected with Leoma Church of Christ and my dad growing up here, one thing my mother has always said about this church is that this is a church that helps people. And if y'all know Deb Ezell, y'all know she wouldn't just say it to say it. She means it. This is a church that helps people. This has been a church that has always cared about its community, always reached out. But what can we do more? Where can we go that we've never been? Who can we reach that we've never tried to reach? Because I'm telling you, even the greatest churches in the world have limits. They have limits to how far they'll go. And Jesus is calling us here to take up that cross, to bear that burden with Him, to be a church that doesn't shy away from evil, but goes straight to it and says, I want to talk to you about the Son of God. And I want to tell you how He is the fulfillment you have been looking for. He is the hope that you've been reaching for. In church, if every single church in the United States of America did that, we wouldn't have a lot of problems. But we can't sit here and pray for every church to change. We got to pray, even if it's only just a little bit, that this church changes. We got to pray, and we have to take action. Remember what we talk about faith? Faith is not just a word, it is a call, a commitment to action. I don't just want to be a Christian that says I am. I want to show the world I am. And I bet you do too. If you don't know Christ and you want to know Christ, if you want Him to heal your brokenness, I beg you to come forward tonight. Don't waste the opportunity. In church, let's keep reaching out to those places that nobody else wants to go to. Please come and stand as we sing.